Patagonia is burning. According to provincial fire authorities, as of January 14, 2026, 13,600 acres have been lost to raging wildfires. Fueled by what officials describe as the worst drought since 1957. This is not a single blaze, but multiple fires igniting across different areas, together constituting a wildfire season of historic proportions. Governor Ignacio Torres, speaking to the press, described the situation as one of the most aggressive fires in the history of the province. While announcing partial containment, he claimed that a group of disgruntled Mapuche activists have been caught red-handed, starting one of the fires. However, despite these official declarations and a media environment eager to repeat them, many local residents point to another group with a record of similar previous incidents and suspicions: Israeli tourists. For many of those locals, suspicions quickly escalated.
This place was our paradise, and they burned it. They abandoned us and destroyed everything. Now they're trying to sell off Patagonia to the Jews. Everyone here knows it. It's full of Israelis buying up land, and no one does anything. The only ones resisting are those who lost everything. They left us completely alone.
Reports of their presence and alleged involvement initially circulated as rumors.
It is really dry, and we just found this handful of gas.
But quickly spread to a protest in Buenos Aires. Particularly after a video emerged in which a local mountain guide allegedly recorded a group of Israeli tourists starting a fire. To learn more about these allegations and their broader implications, we spoke with Argentine journalist Sebastian Salgado.
This week, a video surfaced in which a local Argentine resident recorded Israeli soldiers setting a fire in a prohibited area. For the first time, there is cell phone footage capturing the exact moment the fire was started.
You can't make a fire. You can't make a fire anywhere. There are many fires around, many fires. Pack up your camp and put out the fire.
The young man who recorded the video gave a striking account of the incident. He said he was forced to keep his distance because of one of the individuals involved. Although the person did not speak Spanish, when the young man approached, the individual kept a hand behind his back, as if threatening to pull a weapon. The witness said he wanted to confront them about what they were doing. At the same time, he noticed several other people hiding behind trees in the area, while he was alone. Despite this, the recording remains. This footage is significant not only because it provides concrete evidence of what has long been denounced, that Israeli soldiers, disguised as tourists, are intentionally starting fires, but also because it exposes a trail of corruption in the cover-up being provided by the Argentine government. Otherwise, authorities would be compelled to investigate and pursue those responsible. It should be noted that for the Argentine state, identifying the group of accused tourists would be relatively straightforward. The incident therefore offers important evidence and clues, suggesting that the government of Javier Milei is also implicated in enabling or shielding those responsible.
Governor Torres also linked the fire to the eviction a year ago of what he described as an unregistered Mapuche group from a national park, an area he says they did not legally own and were occupying. Torres also directly linked the incident to an alleged arson attack on industrial and mining vehicles parked outside Estancia Amancay, a few days after the eviction a year ago. However, an anonymous note sent to a community radio station later allegedly claimed responsibility for the arson attack in the name of an alleged Mapuche group resisting a decade-long process of land sales in Patagonia to foreign billionaires such as Joe Louis and Luciano Benetton, each of whom own hundreds of thousands of acres, lands that many local Mapuche consider ancestral territory. This specific anonymous note is one of the main pieces of evidence cited by Governor Torres to justify a series of violent raids and intelligence gathering operations against several Mapuche communities, as well as to place the blame for the current fires on quote-unquote Mapuche groups. However, Torres failed to mention that the suspect apprehended by police after the attack and publicly branded as responsible for the arson was later released after it was corroborated that she was nowhere near the site at the time of the incident, leaving the case unresolved. Former Security and Interior Minister and current Congresswoman Patricia Bullrich took to X to threaten Mapuche groups with terrorism charges, reminding the public that the organization known as RAM, or Mapuche Ancestral Resistance, had already been designated as terrorist group. Both Torres and Bullrich are steadfast allies of President Javier Milei.
Sí, el gobernador Nacho Torres es una persona que
Governor Nacho Torres is someone who, from the very beginning of his campaign, travelled to Israel to receive guidance. This is clearly documented. He even travelled with his security minister. One has to ask, why would the governor of an Argentine Patagonian province need his security minister present while receiving instructions in Israel before even taking office? They themselves made this public on their social media.
La estrategia es bastante parecida a la que usan en Palestina, es culpar a los mapuches de incendiar su propio territorio.
The strategy closely resembles what is used in Palestine, blaming the Mapuche people for setting fires on their own land, labelling them as terrorists, and carrying out arbitrary raids and arrests, even in areas where Israeli soldiers have been documented starting the fires. The objective is to force Mapuche communities to abandon their territories, then raid the few who remain, arresting them and accusing them of burning their own homes. This shows how these situations are being orchestrated.
Entonces, aquí se ve de qué manera se está articulando.
It has been widely reported that Patagonia is one of the destinations where a group of Israeli soldiers regularly travel while on leave, creating a constant flow of IDF personnel camping and moving throughout the region. There are also numerous reports of incidents in which these soldiers ignore or directly disrespect local residents and even local authorities, who often back down, aware that these groups are protected not only by the Argentine federal government, but also by powerful interests, given the significant influence of Zionist organizations in Argentina. Just this week, in January 14, a French-Israeli citizen was arrested for violating fire regulation, specifically for lighting a cigarette. The incident remains under investigation, and the individual is required to return to court. While this is not a major incident in itself, when viewed along a number of similar reports and the fire that occurred in the same park in 2014, it has prompted Chilean authorities to enact tougher measures. This stands in contrast to the approach taken by Argentine authorities in this regard. Salgado's and many others' working assumption is that, no longer protected by past restrictions of natural park laws, Patagonia's land is being deliberately burned so it can be eventually sold for cheap, clearing the way for future development and settlement.
Este tipo de situaciones que conllevan también la presencia de la empresa israelí Mekorot.
With the involvement of the Israeli company Coro, which has been stealing water from Palestinians for decades, and is now firmly established across Argentina, particularly in Patagonia. With the complicity of governors who travel to Israel for instructions and the backing of corporate media, authorities attempt to sustain a narrative that is increasingly losing credibility.
Con el apoyo de los medios corporativos intentan mantener esta retórica que cada vez más va perdiendo sentido.
But the narrative has shifted over the past week, as they realize that people in Argentina have become aware of what we have been denouncing for so long. Now, accusations that Israeli soldiers are setting fires in Patagonia are framed as anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic, following a familiar playbook.
Esta es una acción antijudía, antisemita y todo ese protocolo que ya les conocemos tanto.
In reality, this issue now extends beyond the Argentine Republic and is being examined and exposed by analysts and communicators around the world.
In our previous interview, which viewers interested in this issue should definitely revisit, link below, you mentioned that there have already been other instances in which IDF soldiers were accused of starting fires. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and about why it's not the first time that they have been directly implicated?
Bueno, de la que hay más evidencia es en Torres del Paine porque el soldado Rottensinger fue capturado, ¿sí? Y fue encarcelado por las autoridades chilenas. El problema es que
one of the most documented cases occurred in Torres del Paine, where an Israeli soldier, Rottensinger, was captured and briefly imprisoned by Chilean authorities. As the power structure protecting him became visible, it also became clear that the Chilean judiciary, like its Argentine counterpart, is subject to Zionist influence. In 2014, Singer burned an estimated 50,000 hectares of Torres del Paine National Park. He entered through an illegal crossing, apparently to avoid leaving official records of where the fires were started. Although he was detained, the judicial outcome amounted to a negotiation, a proposed payment of just $7,000 for the destruction of tens of thousands of hectares of native forest. As far as is known, even that amount was never paid. In effect, an irreparable national park ecosystem was destroyed for the equivalent of a minor fine. Today, Rottensinger is reportedly a prominent businessman in Israel. This is the only case that has ever reached court.
De bosque nativo que no se recupera. Y bueno, esto es parte de una realidad que se vive a los dos lados de la frontera. Hoy Rottensinger es un prominente empresario en Israel.
So despite relevant, present, and past incidents, according to the Argentinian government, it is unfair to accuse, detain, and investigate Israeli tourists that were allegedly caught in the act. But it's totally fair to detain and investigate Mapuche groups for similar present and past incidents. Very interesting. Let's see. Rottensinger was taken to court for specifically burning a forest. And, on the other hand, the Mapuche alleged attack a year ago was not a forest fire, but an attack on trucks and tractors. At the same time, Singer's case was in 2014, almost a decade ago, more than a decade ago. Are there other newer instances of fires started by IDF soldiers or Israeli tourists?
Es solo una que haya sido judicializada. Después hay muchos relatos. Hoy mismo
This is the only case that has ever reached court. Since then, numerous other accounts have emerged. Just this week, first-hand testimony from Patagonia described a heavy presence of Israeli soldiers. One local resident attempted to access a section of Lake Puelo he has visited since childhood, only to find a large portion of the shoreline occupied by Israeli soldiers. As he approached via a narrow path, someone attempted to intimidate him into turning back. He continued. When he reached the shore, the soldiers, men and women, turned toward him in unison and began singing in Hebrew. Though he did not understand the words, the coordinated gestures made clear he was being confronted, as if to signal that the area was now under their control. This reflects a reality that is increasingly coming into view, partly because fear has diminished amid the devastation caused by the fires, and partly because the scale of the genocide against the Palestinian people has exposed what Zionism is capable of, where it seeks to establish colonies. While other cases exist in which Israeli soldiers are suspects, only one has been prosecuted. Many never reach trial. Locals report incidents, individuals are briefly detained, and then shielded by authorities. What emerges is a well-oiled structure that consistently guarantees impunity.
Hay evidentemente ahí toda una estructura muy aceitada donde ellos se garantizan su propia impunidad.
I just watched a video where a Palestinian makes a comparison between Argentina now and Palestine a century ago, right?
Now that I'm seeing what's going on in Argentina, I'm starting to second guess. Like, are they making it a getaway for Israelis? Are they trying to make it a second colony? What's going on? I'm not even trying to sugarcoat it. You guys live on one of the most beautiful pieces of land on earth. And if you don't protect it, I'm telling you, this has happened to us. They will take it from you.
So what this Palestinian is suggesting is that eventually that process will be repeated. and they will eventually, once they are in Patagonia, drive the local natives out of that land, right? Which sounds far-fetched. Normally, it would sound far-fetched. But there's this little precedent that initially it was either going to be Palestine or Patagonia when they chose where to found Israel. So they're not pulling this out of thin air. And there's also the old rumor about the Andinia plan, right? On which then Army Chief General Roberto Bendini warned about alleged Israeli intentions to seize Patagonia through covert operations disguised as tourism and NGO work. He did so in front of a class of military, allegedly, as it was reported at the time, and it caused a huge uproar. So, what do you think about these other aspects that are being raised here? Is this a conspiracy theory?
Sí, eso es parte de una realidad. O sea, acá no caben teorías conspiranoicas ni nada. Lo que vos mencionabas es
I mean, there is no room for conspiracy theories here. What you mentioned is, let's say, the structure of the international Zionist project, laid out in the book presented at the Basel Congress in 1890 by Theodore Herzl, The Jewish State. In that book, two possible locations for the establishment of a Jewish state are outlined, and those places are precisely Palestine and Argentina. This is important to remember, and the person in the video makes it very clear. I do not think Palestine was ever chosen in order to abandon the Argentine project. There is very clear evidence that there were extremely significant projects of Jewish autonomy within Argentine territory. At the end of the 19th century, Argentine authorities themselves promoted this. If migrants were seen as white and European, they were welcomed and even given the possibility of pursuing their own autonomy. There is the case of Maurice de Hirsch, and there is also the case in Tierra del Fuego involving Julius Popper, who was at the same time a genocidal figure against the indigenous peoples of Argentina. He arrived with a regiment of more than 100 people under the pretense of searching for gold, when in reality he was seeking autonomy for the province of Tierra del Fuego through a new city he founded, called Atlanta. All the historical records of this exist, but attempts have been made to alter the meaning of that history, portraying Popper as a kind of naturalist or adventurer. In reality, he is unique in the history of the genocide against indigenous peoples, here in that he was photographed with the indigenous people he murdered, posing with his Remington and Winchester rifles against bows and arrows, like a hunter standing over big game. These photographs are easily accessible and can be found online. At the time, Popper himself sent them to Juarez Celman, the Argentine president then in office, who was, to say the least, aware of this autonomy project. This was around the period when Popper travelled to Buenos Aires and later died under rather strange circumstances.
Y posa como quien posa sobre un animal de caza mayor, ¿sí? Esas son fotografías que cualquiera puede encontrar en internet muy rápido porque él se las enviaba.
What the Palestinian streamer says is therefore absolutely true. If only it were possible to go back in time and warn those who believed there could be peaceful coexistence between the Zionist project and the Palestinian Arab and Muslim population, and who perhaps did not resist in the way they should have. The suffering of the new generations of Palestinians today, the infanticide that Israel is carrying out against them, makes it clear that we, as adult Argentines of this moment, bear responsibility for defending our territory and our resources for future generations. Because evidently it is our turn. We are the ones who will one day be asked about that moment when Israeli soldiers began to intimidate the Argentine population, while it was said to be merely a project.
El sufrimiento de las nuevas generaciones palestinas de este momento, el infanticidio que Israel lleva adelante contra todos ellos.
Why didn't they do more? Well, here we are, and I want to tell you, Oscar, that this is taking on dimensions it has never had before. I produced what is essentially the first report of its kind, which I shared with you. One of them is titled Backpackers of Zion. There is no previous record in Argentina featuring first-person testimony about the actions of Israeli soldiers in Patagonia. There is nothing like the footage I recorded outside the Onda Azul Hotel, which forms part of the structure through which Israeli troops pass through Argentina disguised as backpackers. At the same time, I witnessed the activation of numerous protocols against me, many of them surprisingly operating under the guise of Palestinian activism. People presenting themselves as activists for the Palestinian cause began discrediting my work. labeling it a conspiracy theory to claim that Zionism has a project in Argentine Patagonia, deliberately conflating it with what you mentioned earlier, the Andinia plan. There is much debate about whether the Andinia plan originated during the dictatorship, or whether the dictatorship itself had a position on Zionism. For me, the only thing that matters about the Argentine dictatorship is that it murdered 30,000 of my compatriots, regardless of religion. Most were Christians, and there is no need to speculate further. What matters is the reality we are living today. There is a clear project of autonomy and occupation that begins with control over water, continues with control of land, and has already penetrated all three branches of government. The judicial branch works in their favour. The legislative branch, largely due to Milei's electoral victory, is now aligned as well. Milei himself is not merely someone who has agreements with Israel. He is a political product of the Chabad Lubavitch sect. This same network financed figures such as Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of Robert Maxwell, a Mossad-linked figure, who helped build the structure of political blackmail through Jeffrey Epstein. These actors now exercise real power in Argentina, generating unprecedented measures, including allowing Israeli citizens to receive pensions funded by the Argentine state. In other words, individuals born and raised in Israel are granted retirement pensions paid for by the Argentine population. The volume and severity of these policies overwhelm the public, preventing serious debate. That is why those of us engaged in analysis must contribute tools so more people understand the scale of what is happening. What is new and unprecedented is that next Saturday, an openly anti-Zionist demonstration will be held in front of the Argentine Congress. No political party flags will be allowed, only Argentine flags. The purpose is to exchange information, break fear, and confront the anti-Semitism protocols, signed by former President Alberto Fernandez, that have been used to silence dissent. Palestinian activists have been killed here, such as Christian Diaz. Legislators like Vanina Diaz face prosecution for demonstrating in support of Palestine. A federal judge in Mar del Plata is being tried simply for posting an International Criminal Court ruling labeling Netanyahu a war criminal, a ruling to which Argentina is formally bound. At this point, only popular organisation and collective defence remain, because nearly every institution, including many unions, has been absorbed into the structure of Zionist interference in the Argentine Republic.
La organización y la defensa popular, porque todas y cada una de las instituciones, incluyendo muchos de los sindicatos, han pasado a ser parte de la estructura de injerencismo sionista en la República Argentina.
Finally, I understand that you covered a protest in Buenos Aires about the fire. Tell us what the people who are protesting think. Is the blame being placed on the Mapuche people, or what is the situation on the street?
Sí, la protesta de ayer en el obelisco, en la avenida 9 de Julio, en el centro de la ciudad de Buenos Aires, primero era para visibilizar el porteño, o sea, el habitante de la ciudad de Buenos Aires a grandes rasgos vive bastante a espaldas.
The protest yesterday at the Obelisco on Avenida 9 de Julio in the center of Buenos Aires was primarily aimed at raising awareness among the people of Buenos Aires because, broadly speaking, many residents live quite detached from the reality of the rest of the country. There is a widespread belief that important things only happen in Buenos Aires. So one of the first objectives was for people in the city to learn more about what is happening through direct actions, such as holding banners at traffic lights when cars stop, showing that Patagonia is burning. The other objective was a specific denunciation, given the overwhelming evidence, and this has been happening for a long time, that the fires are intentional. Most of the people involved, many of them linked to left-wing parties and movements, are making it clear that those who identify as Mapuche have absolutely nothing to do with the fires, and are, in fact, fighting alongside firefighters to put them out. At the same time, while there is broad agreement that the fires are being deliberately set, I do see fear among representatives of these political parties when it comes to openly stating what we are witnessing. This fear stems from the intimidation faced by fellow legislators who are currently undergoing impeachment processes for making these accusations. Yesterday, when some of them were asked, if the fires are intentional, who do you think is starting them? The strategy they articulated was to avoid mentioning Israeli soldiers. In other words, they argued that it does not matter who is responsible. What matters, they said, is that the Milei government has passed a series of laws, the forest law, the fire law, and the land law, that contribute to the defunding of firefighting efforts and the repression of protest. That is the framework they are trying to emphasize. Still, these responses remain incipient and limited when weighed against the seriousness of the situation.
Que ayudan al desfinanciamiento del combate de los incendios y la protesta intentaban basarla un poco más en eso. Entonces, bueno, son incipientes y son pequeñas en relación a la gravedad de la situación.
President Javier Milei, who is a Chabad Lubavitch member and a very close confidant of Eduardo Elstein and other powerful landowners, investors, and developers, many of them fervent Zionists, has indeed changed the laws, allowing for larger areas to be sold to foreigners, preparing the privatization of natural parks, opening Mapuche areas for development, and eliminating a time frame safety that prevented burned areas to be sold. Now, thanks to him, you can not only buy those burning areas, but also change their use at will. The following is a video of a government official talking to investors.
We have large extensions of land with access to energy, with access to water, in cold climates, which is sort of a cherry on the cake for the cooling of systems. And in an area without armed conflicts, without tsunamis, no earthquakes, there are not that many places on Earth with those things. Obviously, the problem with this area is that it's populated by the Argentinians. So this is the one thing that we have fixed.
Hubo una serie de acciones muy evidentes.
There have been a series of very clear actions by the government aimed at defunding, for example, the national parks. And what about the firefighters? They are paid absurdly low salaries in relation to the risk they face and the work they do in trying to contain fires that, in many cases, remain largely out of control. Thousands upon thousands of hectares have already been destroyed.
Se han acabado con miles y miles de hectáreas. Y otra de las acciones, por ejemplo, importantes es que había 2 helicópteros rusos importantes que...
Another important example is the case of the 2 Russian helicopters that were used for this type of operation, to transport personnel and drop water in emergency situations.
2 helicópteros rusos que Milei le regaló a Zelensky, ¿sí? Como una manera de desprenderse de toda la tecnología rusa.
These 2 helicopters were handed over by Milei to President Zelensky as part of a broader effort to eliminate Russian technology. The official explanation was that spare parts were unavailable due to sanctions imposed by the United States on the Russian Federation, which meant that critical components were no longer arriving. As a result, these important helicopters were given away. This adds a clear geopolitical dimension to the situation, revealing which international actors are also implicated in what is happening.
De dar una dimensión a nivel geopolítico de cuáles son también los actores que están involucrados en todo esto.
Whether Salgado is correct that foreign, primarily Zionist interests are operating behind the scenes to prey on the land and natural wealth of the Argentine people, or whether Governor Torres and the Argentine government are correct in claiming that armed resistance groups within the Mapuche community are setting fires and destroying their own ancestral forests, one thing is clear. The suspected parties have very different, though equally evident, motives. One group claims to be defending its land. The other may be seeking to take control of it. Yet it is striking that only one of these groups has been subjected to serious investigation. Faced with a crisis of this magnitude, President Javier Milei's only response was a belated post on X, using an AI-generated image to thank the volunteers and brigade members who, defunded by his own government, are risking their lives to contain the fires. Add to this a historic draw and a current very aggressive austerity regime that has defunded nearly every area of government, laying off park rangers, firefighters, and federal staff, slashing maintenance, logistics, and research budgets, weakening emergency services infrastructure, and it becomes very clear that the natural wonder of Patagonia is in serious danger.